You took
Imagine being told by the one person you thought would always have your back that you're too old to be loved. That's exactly what happened to Kevin. For years, he had sacrificed everything for his son, Carl. But when Kevin's health began to decline, Carl's attitude changed. His son, the one Kevin had worked tirelessly to provide for, turned cold and dismissive, thinking his father's age had rendered him unworthy of love. "You're too old to find love," Carl said, his words cutting deeper than any physical wound. At first, Kevin was taken aback. He couldn't believe that the person he had dedicated his life to would say something so heartless. But instead of sinking into despair, Kevin decided to prove Carl wrong. He refused to let age dictate his happiness. So, Kevin did something unexpected. He took action. He joined a local community center, seeking companionship and a new sense of purpose. And that's when he met Mary, a widow in a similar situation. Mary had also been cast aside by her children. Together, they found solace and comfort in each other's company. But Carl's reaction was swift. He didn't understand. He couldn't stand the thought of his father moving on without him. He was jealous, frustrated, and angry. But Kevin, determined to live life on his own terms, calmly explained that love has no expiration date. And that was the moment Carl's entire perspective shifted. This is a story about the strength of the human spirit, about how love doesn't fade with age, and how one man's courage changed not just his life, but the life of his son forever. Stay tuned to see how Kevin's journey of self-discovery and resilience proved that true love knows no bounds. Kevin had always been the kind of man who put others before himself. Raised in a modest home, he learned early on the importance of hard work and dedication. His father was a fisherman, and Kevin often joined him at the crack of dawn, hauling nets and mending ropes. Life wasn't easy, but it was simple, and Kevin had always believed that if you worked hard enough, you could make a difference, not just in your own life, but in the lives of those you loved. That belief became the cornerstone of everything he did. When Kevin married his high school sweetheart, Karen, he had no illusions about the challenges ahead. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. The first few years were filled with the joys of starting a family, teaching Carl to ride a bike, taking weekend trips to the beach, and creating memories together. It was a time of growth and happiness, and Kevin poured his heart into being the best husband and father he could be. As the years went by, Kevin worked his way up in the construction business, taking on more responsibility and earning enough to provide for his family comfortably. The sacrifices were many: late nights at the office, missing family dinners, and the physical toll of years spent on construction sites. But Kevin never complained. He always believed it was worth it for his family. Every penny he earned, every hour he worked was for them. But as time passed, the sacrifices began to take their toll. Karen fell ill, and the weight of caring for her, managing the household, and keeping up with his demanding job became overwhelming. Kevin never once wavered in his devotion. He took time off to care for Karen, attending doctor's appointments, cooking meals, and doing everything he could to make her comfortable. But despite his best efforts, Karen passed away after a long battle with cancer. It was a loss that left a hole in Kevin's heart, a hole that no amount of work or material success could fill. He was left to face the world alone, a grieving widower and a father who still had to take care of his son, Carl. Carl, however, was growing up fast. As a teenager, Carl was already beginning to distance himself. He was rebellious, often coming home late and picking fights with his father over trivial matters. Kevin chalked it up to the typical struggles of adolescence. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between them. Years passed, and Carl went off to college. Kevin thought the distance between them would be temporary, just a phase. But as Carl entered adulthood, the divide only seemed to widen. Kevin's calls went unanswered, and Carl began visiting less frequently. It was clear that Kevin's presence in his son's life was no longer a priority. When Kevin retired, he hoped the extra time would allow him to rebuild their relationship. But instead, it was like he had become invisible to Carl. Kevin began to feel like an outsider in his own family. Despite everything he had done for Carl, sacrificing his own dreams, working long hours to provide, and putting his family's needs above his own. He was now the one left alone. The final blow came one rainy afternoon when Kevin, feeling the weight of his loneliness, attempted to reconnect with Carl. They sat down in the living room, and Kevin spoke from the heart. "Carl, I know I haven't always been there for you like I should have, but I'm still your father. I love you and I miss you. Can we talk? Can we try to reconnect?" But instead of the warmth he hoped for, Carl's response was cold and dismissive. "Dad, you're too old to be chasing after a relationship. You're too old to find love again. You need to accept it and let it go." The words hit Kevin harder than he expected. It wasn't just the dismissal. It was the finality in Carl's tone. It was as if he had been written off, not just as a father, but as a person who still had a future worth living. Kevin didn't know how to respond. His son, the one he had worked so hard to raise, the one he had sacrificed so much for, now saw him as nothing more than a burden. That moment changed something inside Kevin. He could have let the bitterness fester, could have given in to the despair of loneliness and old age. But something inside him refused to accept that his story was over. He wasn't ready to fade into the background just yet. He wasn't ready to be discarded like an old photograph or forgotten like a piece of furniture. Kevin realized that he had a lot of life left to live, and it was up to him to make the most of it. With newfound determination, Kevin joined a local community center. It wasn't much, just a small building with a few activities and a handful of regulars. But it was something. It was a place where he could reconnect with the world, meet new people, and, most importantly, find a sense of belonging that he had been missing for so long. The first few days were awkward. Kevin was older than most of the people there, and he wasn't sure what to expect. But soon enough, he found his rhythm. He started participating in art classes, social events, and even some volunteer work. The more time he spent at the center, the more he realized that life was still full of possibilities. And it was there, in the midst of a community of people who understood him, that he met Mary. Mary, like Kevin, had been through her own share of heartache. She had lost her husband years ago, and her children, consumed with their own lives, had all but forgotten her. But when Kevin and Mary met, something clicked. They shared stories of their past, their losses, and their hopes for the future. They formed a bond that neither had expected. For the first time in a long time, Kevin felt like he had a real connection with someone. And more importantly, he felt like he still had the capacity for love. It was this connection, this newfound joy, that would ultimately prove Carl's words wrong. Kevin had much more to give: love, companionship, and the wisdom that came with age, and he wasn't going to let anyone, even his son, take that away from him. Kevin's life was beginning to change in ways he hadn't expected. After years of isolation, after the loneliness that settled in following Karen's death, he had found something new, a spark of hope. His relationship with Mary had brought a newfound sense of purpose. Together, they shared quiet mornings at the community center, conversations over coffee, and an unexpected joy in each other's company. Mary had given Kevin the companionship he had longed for, and he had done the same for her. She was kind, understanding, and had a sharp wit that matched his own. For the first time in years, Kevin felt alive, as if the world hadn't passed him by just because he had gotten older. But the peace Kevin had begun to enjoy didn't last. It didn't take long before Carl found out about Mary. At first, Kevin tried to downplay the relationship, not wanting to upset Carl. He had spent years trying to be the best father he could, and he didn't want to cause a rift by pursuing happiness at this stage in his life. But when Carl visited one weekend and discovered Kevin spending time with her, everything changed. Carl's reaction was immediate and harsh. He couldn't believe his father, whom he had always seen as weak and vulnerable in his old age, was forming a relationship with someone. His mind couldn't grasp it. The idea that Kevin, someone who had been so focused on providing for his family, always sacrificing his own desires for theirs, was now finding happiness outside of Carl's narrow expectations, rattled him. "Dad, what are you doing?" Carl asked sharply, a tone of disbelief mixed with frustration. "You're old. You should be focusing on your health, not some woman. This isn't right." Kevin stood there, stunned by Carl's words. He hadn't expected Carl to react like this. He'd hoped for understanding, or at least acceptance. But instead, Carl's face was twisted with confusion and disdain. "I'm just trying to live my life," Kevin said, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet hurt. "I've spent my whole life making sacrifices for you, for your mother. Now I'm just trying to enjoy the time I have left." Carl's face flushed with anger. "Enjoy? You don't have time left for this. You're not young anymore, and you're certainly not in a place where you can be with someone new. What would people think? What will they say about you? You're embarrassing yourself." The words hit Kevin hard, but he stood his ground. "Carl, this isn't about other people's opinions. It's about my happiness, my life. I deserve that." But Carl wasn't listening. His anger boiled over, and in a fit of frustration, he lashed out. "This is ridiculous," Carl muttered, shaking his head. "I don't need to see this. You're acting like you're some teenager chasing love. Get a grip, Dad." Carl stormed out, leaving Kevin standing there, his heart heavy with both pain and disbelief. What had happened? When had his son come to see him as someone incapable of love, of joy, of a life beyond his responsibilities as a father? The word Carl had said felt like a betrayal, not just of Kevin's relationship with Mary, but of Kevin himself. The seed of doubt had been planted, and Kevin found himself questioning everything. Had he made a mistake? Was he too old for happiness? Too old to seek companionship? But despite the self-doubt, Kevin could not deny the connection he had with Mary. It wasn't a fleeting attraction. It was something deeper, something real. She was his equal, his partner in ways that he hadn't realized he had been missing for so long. And yet, here was his son, rejecting it, dismissing it, telling him that love had no place in his life because of his age. Carl's rejection of Kevin's pursuit of happiness sparked something in Kevin that he hadn't felt in years: defiance. He wasn't going to let Carl dictate his life. He had raised Carl, given him everything, worked tirelessly to ensure his son's future. Now, it was time for Kevin to take back control. But the conflict didn't end with Carl's outburst. As the weeks passed, Carl's behavior grew more erratic. He would show up unannounced, making passive-aggressive remarks, criticizing Mary whenever they were in the same room. Kevin could see the jealousy and resentment bubbling to the surface. He could see Carl struggling with the idea of his father living a life independent of him, a life where Carl was no longer the center of Kevin's world. It wasn't just about Mary anymore. It was about control. Carl couldn't stand the thought of losing his father to someone else, especially someone who wasn't even part of their family. Kevin began to feel like he was being pushed into a corner. The more Carl rejected the idea of his father finding love, the more Kevin realized how deep the wounds of their relationship ran. Despite Kevin's best efforts to explain, Carl refused to understand. And as time went on, the emotional toll became harder to bear. Kevin loved his son deeply, but Carl's unwillingness to accept his independence, his refusal to see his father as someone who deserved love and happiness, was slowly suffocating their relationship. Kevin's once peaceful world, where he had found solace and companionship, was now filled with tension. It felt like a war, one that wasn't just about love and age, but about identity, respect, and the meaning of family. Kevin was being forced to make a choice: hold on to his relationship with Carl, or hold on to his newfound happiness with Mary. In the back of his mind, Kevin knew that whatever decision he made, it wouldn't be easy. His relationship with Carl had been the most important thing in his life for so long. But now he realized that he couldn't continue to sacrifice his own happiness for someone who couldn't see past his age. He had worked hard for years to give Carl everything, and now it was time to fight for something he had only recently found: the chance to live fully, to love, to be happy. The conflict was inevitable. But Kevin knew that whatever the outcome, this was his time to stand up for himself, for his heart, and for the life he still had left to live. The tension between Kevin and Carl continued to build, like a storm slowly gathering strength. Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that Carl's rejection wasn't just about Mary. It was about something deeper, a fear of losing his father, of being abandoned. Carl had always been the center of Kevin's world, but now it seemed that Kevin had stepped aside, choosing to build a life for himself without the approval or presence of his son. Kevin didn't fully understand why this hurt Carl so much, but it was clear that his son's actions went beyond mere jealousy. Carl's words were laced with a kind of bitter finality, as if Kevin's life was no longer worth living unless it fit into his son's narrow view of what it should be. Kevin had always been a man of patience. He understood the struggles of life, the hardships, the sacrifices, and the inevitable losses. But with Carl, the patience was wearing thin. Each passing day felt like an emotional battleground, where every conversation, every interaction felt loaded with unspoken resentment. Kevin had tried reaching out to Carl, attempting to bridge the divide, but Carl wasn't interested. It was clear now that Carl wanted his father to fit into his version of what a parent should be. A parent who lived for their children, not for themselves. One evening, Kevin sat alone in the living room, the house still and quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. He reflected on the years he had spent putting his family first, sacrificing his own desires, postponing his dreams. Kevin had worked hard to ensure Carl never lacked for anything. Every decision he made, every extra hour he worked, was always in service of his son's future. But where had it gotten him? Now, Carl was an adult, and instead of expressing gratitude or understanding, Carl resented the very thing that made Kevin who he was, his ability to love, to seek companionship, to live beyond the role of father and provider. Kevin's emotions were torn. On the one hand, he felt betrayed, not just by Carl's words, but by the lack of empathy his son seemed to have for him. But on the other hand, there was a part of Kevin that understood the root of Carl's pain. He knew that Carl had always seen him as a constant, as someone who would always be there to take care of him. The idea of Kevin moving on, of Kevin finding happiness in something other than Carl's needs, was a hard pill to swallow for his son. It was a betrayal, in Carl's eyes, of the man he had known all his life. The father who had always been available to help, to give, to sacrifice. Carl didn't know how to handle a father who was no longer just his father. Kevin was becoming someone else entirely, someone independent, someone with his own desires and needs. In his heart, Kevin knew that he couldn't keep living for Carl's approval. He couldn't keep bending to the expectations of a son who refused to accept his father as a person outside of his role as a parent. But the thought of severing ties with Carl, of fully choosing his own happiness over his son's approval, felt like an unbearable weight. The guilt gnawed at him. He had always wanted the best for Carl, but now it seemed like no matter what he did, it would never be enough. The emotional stakes were escalating. Kevin was beginning to realize that this conflict wasn't just about a relationship with a woman. It was about his relationship with himself. Mary had come into Kevin's life at a time when he had given up on finding love, on finding joy outside of his duties as a father. She was more than just a companion. She was the proof that Kevin still had the capacity to love and be loved. And yet, every time Carl rejected her, Kevin was forced to choose between his son and his newfound happiness. How could he keep sacrificing his own emotional well-being for a son who seemed incapable of understanding his needs? In the silence of that evening, Kevin's mind replayed the moments of his life, the years he had spent building a future for Carl, the nights he had stayed awake worrying about his son's future, and the countless sacrifices he had made. Kevin had always been the one who gave. But now, he needed something for himself, something that didn't revolve around Carl's approval. Yet, Carl's constant rejection left Kevin questioning whether he had the right to ask for that. The internal conflict was unbearable. Kevin loved his son, but he also loved himself enough to know that he deserved more than the life Carl had planned for him. He deserved happiness, independence, and the right to love again. But could he get there without losing his son in the process? Could he stand his ground and still be the father Carl needed? Or would he have to choose between love and family? As the weeks passed, Kevin's world seemed to narrow, drawn tighter by Carl's refusal to understand. The emotional weight of the conflict began to take a toll on Kevin. His days, once filled with the simple joys of companionship with Mary, were now clouded with tension and guilt. Each phone call, each encounter with Carl, felt like walking on a tightrope. He couldn't seem to find the balance between being the father Carl wanted and being the man he was becoming. Carl's resentment toward Kevin's relationship with Mary grew more pronounced. Kevin could see it in his son's eyes. The subtle gestures of anger, the cold silences, the biting remarks that followed. Carl had always been sharp with his words, but now they carried a venom that stung deeper than ever. Each time Kevin tried to explain himself or justify his actions, Carl shut him down, unwilling to listen. The more Kevin tried to make Carl see, the more Carl's walls grew higher. It was as if he couldn't, or wouldn't, accept that his father had a life beyond him. It was one evening, after another heated argument, when Kevin felt the true weight of what was happening. Carl had stormed out of the house after another confrontation, leaving Kevin standing in the doorway, his heart heavy with a mixture of frustration and sadness. Kevin closed the door slowly, his hands trembling. He had spent his whole life teaching Carl the value of family, love, and respect. But now all of that seemed to be falling apart. It was as if Carl had forgotten everything Kevin had done for him, everything they had been through together. Kevin sat down in the dim light of the living room, his mind racing. He had always been there for Carl, always put him first, but now it felt like Carl was rejecting him at every turn. It wasn't just about Mary. It was about Kevin's right to have a life of his own, to love, to be happy without guilt. The realization hit Kevin like a tidal wave. He had spent so many years bending to Carl's needs, to the point where he had lost himself. For years, he had sacrificed his own happiness for Carl, believing that was what a father was supposed to do. But now, as Carl rejected him, Kevin realized that no matter what he did, it would never be enough for his son. The emotional toll of trying to be everything Carl needed was breaking him. The conflict wasn't just tearing apart Kevin's relationship with Carl. It was also forcing Kevin to confront his own feelings of inadequacy. Could he ever be the father Carl wanted, the one who didn't need love or companionship of his own? Could he be the man he had once been, the one who found strength in the love he gave, not just in what he sacrificed? The emotional stakes had shifted. It wasn't just about Carl's rejection anymore. It was about Kevin finding his own sense of self-worth, his own happiness. And the more Carl pushed him away, the more Kevin realized he had been living for someone else's idea of who he should be. Kevin's love for his son was unconditional, but that didn't mean he should sacrifice his entire existence for Carl's approval. He couldn't keep pouring himself into a relationship that drained him while Carl continued to push him into a corner. Kevin began to understand that his emotional survival depended on accepting that Carl might never fully understand his choices. Carl might never accept that his father could love again, could seek happiness outside of the role he had always played. Kevin had been a father for so long, but now he was learning that he had to be something more, that he had the right to be more. But as Kevin grappled with this realization, the emotional stakes grew even higher. It wasn't just about losing Carl's approval. It was about the fear of losing his son entirely. Kevin had always believed in unconditional love, in the idea that family could withstand anything. But what if Carl couldn't accept this new version of Kevin? What if, in trying to find his own happiness, Kevin lost the one person who had always been a part of his life? The thought was unbearable. Kevin's heart ached at the thought of losing his son, and yet he knew he couldn't keep sacrificing his own well-being in the name of a relationship that no longer served him. Every time Carl came around, every time he rejected Kevin's choices, it felt like a crack in their bond, a wedge driven deeper into their once strong relationship. Kevin began to question if there would ever be a moment when Carl would accept him for who he had become, not just as a father, but as a man with his own needs, his own desires. The longer the conflict dragged on, the more Kevin feared that the bridge between them might be irreparable. The emotional strain was immense. Kevin found himself torn between the man he wanted to be and the father Carl needed him to be. It wasn't just about love anymore. It was about survival, Kevin's emotional survival, and his ability to remain true to himself no matter the cost. Every conversation with Carl felt like a battle, and with each passing day, Kevin's fear grew. Would he ever find peace, or would he forever be caught in the conflict between family and self? The turning point came unexpectedly, like a quiet whisper in the midst of an overwhelming storm. Kevin had spent months wrestling with his emotions, trying to make sense of his fractured relationship with Carl. His heart was heavy, his spirit worn thin from the constant push and pull between his son's demands and his own desperate need for independence. It felt as though there was no way out. The anger and frustration from Carl, the guilt that gnawed at Kevin's chest, and the slow erosion of his connection with his son had all reached a boiling point. Kevin could no longer ignore the ache in his heart, the ache for love, for understanding, for a bond that wasn't defined by his responsibilities as a father. One afternoon, as Kevin sat alone in his living room, he gazed out the window at the familiar trees swaying in the breeze. The peacefulness of the scene seemed so distant from the turmoil inside him. For the first time in months, Kevin let the quiet settle in around him. He had been so focused on fixing everything, on trying to make Carl see his point of view, that he hadn't stopped to reflect on his own journey. It was in that moment of stillness, as the weight of the years he had spent in self-sacrifice sank in, that Kevin had an epiphany. He had been so consumed by Carl's needs, so absorbed in the idea of being the perfect father, that he had neglected one crucial aspect of life, his own humanity. In his relentless efforts to be everything for Carl, he had lost sight of who he was beyond his role as a parent. The realization hit him hard. He had forgotten how to live for himself. Kevin understood, for the first time, that his love for Carl had been genuine and deep, but that love could not come at the cost of his own well-being. He had sacrificed so much, but he was no longer willing to sacrifice his right to happiness. He couldn't keep carrying the weight of Carl's rejection on his shoulders. He couldn't keep trying to live a life that wasn't his own, just to gain approval from someone who didn't understand what he needed. The revelation was both liberating and painful. Kevin knew that by choosing to live for himself, he would create distance from Carl, a distance that might never be bridged. The fear of losing his son, of being cut off completely, still loomed large. But the truth was undeniable. He couldn't continue to exist solely for Carl's validation. For the first time, Kevin saw his relationship with Carl for what it was, a dynamic that had always been defined by Kevin's selflessness. In all these years, Kevin had poured everything into being the perfect father. But in doing so, he had become a shell of himself. The sacrifices had eroded his own identity, and the man he had once been had been buried under the weight of obligation. What he had forgotten, until now, was that he had the right to reclaim his own happiness, regardless of Carl's acceptance. The turning point didn't come with a dramatic confrontation or a grand gesture. It came quietly, in the form of self-acceptance. Kevin realized that he had been living in fear, trying to appease Carl, trying to regain the closeness they once shared. But the truth was, Carl had already made his choices, and now it was time for Kevin to make his own. He picked up his phone, looking at Mary's number. Their relationship had blossomed slowly, but it had been real. Mary had helped Kevin rediscover joy, and she had shown him that life didn't end with age. It was just beginning. It was Mary who had reminded him that love didn't have an expiration date, and that happiness could be found even after the pain of loss. Kevin called her. As the phone rang, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. Mary answered, and Kevin found himself speaking words that had been buried inside him for far too long. "Mary, I need to be honest with you. I've been so caught up in trying to fix things with Carl, so focused on what I thought I needed to do as a father, that I forgot how to live for myself. I don't want to lose Carl, but I can't keep sacrificing my happiness anymore. I'm ready to be the man I was always meant to be, even if that means taking a step back from Carl. I can't keep trying to make him accept my life. I have to live my life for me." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, Kevin wondered if he had made a mistake. But then Mary spoke, her voice steady and warm. "Kevin, you've been so strong for so long. You've given everything to Carl, to your family. But now it's your turn. I'll be here with you, every step of the way. Whatever happens with Carl, you have the right to live your life, to love, to be happy." Kevin's chest tightened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The revelation wasn't just about his relationship with Carl. It was about reclaiming his own life, his own identity. It wasn't about giving up on Carl, but about letting go of the guilt and the fear that had kept him stuck in a role he no longer fit. It was time to move forward. Kevin didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a choice. And that in itself was the most freeing thing of all. The first step toward Kevin's newfound resolve came when Carl unexpectedly showed up at his house a week after their last heated argument. Kevin had been preparing himself for this moment for days, unsure of how to react, unsure of whether his son would even want to speak to him again. But there Carl was, standing at the door, looking less like the confident young man Kevin had once known and more like a boy who had realized he was losing something important. Kevin opened the door slowly, his heart pounding. Carl's face was a mixture of frustration and uncertainty. The tension was palpable, but there was something different about this moment. Gone was the anger that had fueled their previous encounters. Instead, Carl seemed almost vulnerable. His posture was slumped, his hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. "Dad, can we talk?" Carl's voice was low, hesitant. Kevin stood for a moment, his emotions swirling inside him. The father in him wanted to reach out, to pull Carl in and fix everything, but the man who had finally begun to reclaim his own life knew that the time for fixing everything was over. His love for Carl had never wavered, but Kevin had come to understand that there was only so much he could give without losing himself in the process. "Sure," Kevin said, stepping aside to let Carl in. "Come in." The two of them sat at the kitchen table, an awkward silence hanging between them. Kevin could feel Carl's eyes on him, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them both. Carl was the first to speak. I don't know what I was thinking," Carl admitted, his voice tight with emotion. "I was angry. I didn't want to admit that you have a life outside of me. It's just hard for me to accept. I guess I've always relied on you, Dad. You've always been there, and now it feels like I'm losing you." Kevin's chest tightened as he listened to his son. For so long, he had tried to understand Carl's perspective, but hearing it aloud made everything crystal clear. Carl wasn't rejecting Kevin's happiness because he didn't care. He was rejecting it because he was afraid of losing the father he had always known. It wasn't just about Mary or Kevin's age or his right to love again. It was about Carl's fear that if Kevin found something outside of him, there would be nothing left of their bond. "I've always been here for you, Carl," Kevin said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I've sacrificed everything for you, but I can't keep sacrificing myself anymore. I need to live too. I need to have a life just like you do. And I know that's hard to hear, but it's the truth." Carl looked down at the table, his face flushed with shame. Kevin could see the internal struggle in his son's eyes. The battle between the part of him that still wanted to cling to his father's love and the part that was beginning to realize that love had to come from a place of mutual respect, not dependence. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that," Carl murmured, his voice cracking. I guess I just didn't know what to do when you started changing. I felt like I was being left behind." Kevin's heart ached as he saw the tears welling up in Carl's eyes. The anger, the resentment, the walls, everything was coming down. This was the conversation Kevin had been waiting for, the conversation that would either heal their relationship or break it forever. But Kevin knew, in this moment, that healing didn't come with easy solutions or quick fixes. It came with honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to embrace change, even when it was painful. "I'm not leaving you behind, Carl," Kevin said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I can't keep living for you either. I've spent my whole life putting your needs first, and I've forgotten what it feels like to live for myself. I'm not going to stop loving you. I'm not going anywhere. But I need to live too. I need to have a life that's my own, and that means finding happiness, even if it doesn't fit into the mold I've always been in." Carl wiped at his eyes, nodding slowly. Kevin could see the realization dawning on him. It wasn't an immediate acceptance, but it was a step forward, a willingness to understand, a willingness to see his father not as the man who existed to serve him, but as the man who deserved to live his own life. "I get it, Dad," Carl said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to hold you back. I guess I've just been so scared, you know? I didn't know how to handle it when you started living for yourself." but I don't want you to feel like you can't do that." Kevin smiled faintly, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But in that moment, Kevin knew that something had shifted. It wasn't just about Mary or Carl's acceptance of their relationship. It was about the truth. Kevin had reclaimed his life, and Carl was beginning to understand that. They were both learning that love didn't mean sacrificing who you were. It meant supporting each other's growth, even when it was hard. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding. And for the first time in a long while, Kevin felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. This was the beginning of something new, not just for him and Carl, but for their relationship as father and son, one built on mutual respect and the freedom to live authentically. Kevin had chosen his happiness, and in doing so, he had taken the first step toward healing not just himself, but his relationship with Carl. And that, he realized, was the most powerful decision he could ever make. The room was quiet, but it was no longer the heavy silence that had filled it before. Instead, it was a calm, tentative quiet, the kind that comes when two people begin to truly listen to one another, when the walls that once separated them start to crumble. Kevin could feel the shift in the air, like the first breath of spring after a long, bitter winter. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a start, a fragile, yet significant step forward. Carl's eyes flickered up to meet Kevin's, his expression softening as he processed his father's words. Kevin could see the internal battle waging within him. It was clear that Carl had been holding on to so much fear and confusion, unable to articulate what he needed or how to confront the changes in their dynamic. But now, as Kevin spoke from the heart, Carl's resistance began to wane. "You don't have to stop loving me," Carl said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong. I see that now. It's just, I've never seen you as a person outside of being my dad. It's like, you were always just there, doing everything for me. And now that you're changing, it scares me. It makes me feel like I don't know where I fit in anymore." Kevin's heart clenched. He knew that Carl's words weren't about rejection. It was fear. Fear of losing the stability, the certainty that had always existed between them. Kevin had been Carl's anchor for so long, and now, as he found a way to live his own life, Carl was struggling to understand how to navigate this new reality. "I've always been your dad, Carl," Kevin said, his voice steady but soft. "But I'm also a person. I have needs, too. I've always been there for you, and I will continue to be. But now, I need to be there for myself, too. And that doesn't mean I love you any less. It just means that I'm not just your father. I'm Kevin, and I deserve the chance to be happy, just like you do." Carl looked down at the table, his fingers nervously tapping the surface. He was processing it all, his father's honesty, his willingness to change, and the realization that their relationship would never be the same again. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope in his eyes, not just confusion or resentment. Carl was starting to understand, not just Kevin's need for independence, but the fact that their love, their bond, didn't have to be defined by old patterns and expectations. "You're right," Carl muttered, almost to himself. "You're not just my dad. I guess I've been treating you like you were just a role. I didn't see you as a person with your own life. And I'm sorry for that. I know I can be selfish, but I didn't mean to hurt you." Kevin reached across the table, placing his hand on Carl's. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a sign of acceptance, of reconciliation. Kevin's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. They weren't there yet. They weren't magically healed, but the foundation of something better was being laid in this moment. "Carl," Kevin said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've never wanted to be just a figure in your life. I've always wanted to be someone you could rely on, someone you could be proud of. But I also want you to know that I'm proud of you. And I'm proud of the man you're becoming. This doesn't change my love for you. It's just, I need to live my life too." Carl's eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, he let the walls come down. The anger, the bitterness, it all melted away. Kevin could see his son, truly see him now. Not just as a reflection of his own sacrifices, but as an individual who was grappling with his own fears, his own insecurities. "I don't want to lose you, Dad," Carl said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I get it. I do. And I'm sorry for making you feel like you weren't allowed to live. I'm proud of you too, for finding your happiness. I didn't know how to handle it." Kevin squeezed Carl's hand gently, offering him a reassuring smile. "You're not going to lose me, Carl. No matter what happens, I'll always be your father. But you have to know, you're not the only one who deserves happiness. I do too." The emotional weight in the room was finally beginning to lift. Carl's shoulders, which had been so tense and rigid, seemed to relax. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, to let go of the burden of fear that had been holding him back. In that moment, Kevin knew that they had crossed a threshold. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges, still moments of uncertainty. But they were no longer stuck in the past, trapped in a cycle of resentment and guilt. They had both taken the first step toward understanding, toward healing, and toward a future where they could both live their lives authentically. As Carl stood up, looking at Kevin with a soft, tentative smile, Kevin felt something shift inside him. The conflict hadn't just been about Carl's acceptance. It had been about Kevin's willingness to let go of the fear that had kept him stuck in the shadows of his own life. By claiming his right to happiness, Kevin had not only opened the door to a new chapter in his relationship with Carl, but to a new chapter in his own life. I think I'm ready to try," Carl said, his voice steady now, a faint hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "For both of us." Kevin nodded, feeling a tear slip down his cheek. "We'll figure it out, Carl. Together." And in that moment, Kevin knew that no matter what came next, they had taken the most important step. They had faced their fears, embraced their truths, and chosen to grow together. And that, Kevin realized, was all that mattered. The weeks that followed were a period of transformation for both Kevin and Carl. While the emotional scars of their past weren't healed overnight, the breakthrough in their relationship marked a significant shift, a shift rooted in mutual respect, understanding, and the acceptance of each other's humanity. Kevin, no longer shackled by the weight of guilt and expectation, began to embrace his own life fully. He spent more time with Mary, continued to find joy in the community center, and reconnected with parts of himself that had been buried for years. He no longer felt like a father first and foremost. He was Kevin, a man who had lived, loved, and lost, but who was now ready to live again. For Carl, the journey was equally transformative. Though his pride and resistance had kept him distant for so long, the conversations with his father had allowed him to see Kevin not just as a provider, but as a person with needs, dreams, and the capacity for happiness beyond his role as a father. Carl's own growth was evident. He began to reflect more deeply on his own life, questioning the patterns he had followed and the expectations he had placed on those around him. While there were still moments of discomfort and adjustment, Carl found himself letting go of the fear that had once driven his actions. Slowly, he learned to embrace the idea that love doesn't require control, that it can coexist with independence and personal growth. The healing wasn't without its bumps. There were still awkward silences, still moments of tension, but the difference now was that they were talking. Kevin and Carl were finally communicating in a way they hadn't for years. Kevin no longer felt like he had to walk on eggshells around his son. He had reclaimed his voice, his sense of self, and was able to express his emotions without fear of judgment. Carl, too, had learned that his father's happiness wasn't a threat to their bond, but a reflection of the strength in their relationship. One Sunday afternoon, several months after their breakthrough conversation, Kevin and Carl sat together at the kitchen table, a much more peaceful atmosphere between them. The air no longer felt heavy, but light, filled with a quiet understanding. They were no longer trapped in the roles they had defined for themselves, but rather they had begun to build something new, something grounded in honesty and respect. "Dad," Carl began, his voice calm, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how you deserve to live your own life, too. I'm sorry for all the times I made you feel like you didn't have that right. You've always been there for me, but I guess I didn't realize that you needed something for yourself, too." Kevin looked at his son, his heart swelling with both pride and relief. "Thank you, Carl. I know it wasn't easy for you, and I appreciate you seeing that. It wasn't about me wanting to leave you behind. It was about me finding a way to live, to be happy, without losing the bond we have. I've always loved you, but I needed to love myself too. Carl nodded, his expression thoughtful. I understand now. It's not about us being separate. It's about us both growing and still being there for each other, just in different ways. I want to do better, Dad. I want to support you, just like you've always supported me. Kevin smiled, feeling the weight of years of tension and miscommunication lift from his shoulders. We're learning, Carl, and I'm proud of you for understanding, for seeing the bigger picture. We've got a long way to go, but this is a good start. The conversation was a turning point for both of them. It was the moment when Kevin and Carl realized that the love between them wasn't fragile. It was strong enough to withstand their differences, their fears, and their growth. It was the kind of love that could evolve, that could change with time, but always remain rooted in the deep connection they shared as father and son. As the months passed, Kevin continued to embrace his new life. He grew closer to Mary, taking their relationship to new depths. He traveled, spent time with friends, and started new hobbies he had put off for years. He realized that he wasn't defined by his past, by his roles, or by the expectations others had of him. He was free to live as he chose, without guilt, and that freedom brought a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Carl, too, began to flourish. He found his own passions, started making time for his own happiness, and learned to support his father without feeling threatened by his independence. The tension between them didn't disappear overnight, but it was no longer the driving force of their relationship. They were becoming two people who could live their lives fully and still find joy in each other's company. The story of Kevin and Carl wasn't one of simple resolution. It wasn't about fixing everything in one conversation. It was about learning to live with change, to grow through it, and to understand that love isn't about possession. It's about support, respect, and the freedom to become who you're meant to be. Kevin had taught his son the most valuable lesson of all, that love is not a sacrifice, but a choice to grow together, even when the road ahead is uncertain. And so, Kevin's life moved forward, filled with possibility, not just as a father, but as a man who had learned the power of self-love and the importance of living authentically. And Carl, standing beside him, was ready to walk that path, too, no longer as a son in need of guidance, but as a son who had learned that true love begins with the freedom to be yourself. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between the needs of your loved ones and your own happiness? What would you do if the very people you love the most couldn't understand your need to live for yourself? We all go through difficult transitions, and sometimes those moments of change bring us closer to the people we love, and sometimes they challenge the relationships we hold dear. But just like Kevin and Carl's story, it's possible to grow through those moments and find new ways of loving and supporting each other. If you've ever struggled with a similar situation or faced the challenge of balancing your needs with the expectations of others, I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about the importance of self-love, understanding, and growth in relationships. If you found Kevin and Carl's journey inspiring, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about love, family, and personal transformation. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, we can create a community where we can support each other in embracing change, finding our own happiness, and learning to love more deeply. Share this video with someone who might need to hear this message today. Let's remind each other that it's never too late to start living for ourselves and to love ourselves, no matter our age or the circumstances. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments below. Keep growing, keep loving, and remember, your happiness matters too.